When signature policies collide with scandal. The twin collapse. There is a particular kind of political disaster that occurs when a leader's signature achievement begins to crumble at precisely the moment their personal credibility is under assault. When the policy that defines their brand, that justifies their claim to power, that separates them from all predecessors, suddenly fails in spectacular fashion, while scandal consumes their administration's bandwidth and moral authority. We are witnessing that convergence right now. The Trump administration, already engulfed in the political firestorm surrounding the Epstein files and the exposure of survivor identities while alleged perpetrators remain protected, now faces the operational collapse of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the agency that was supposed to execute the mass deportation agenda that formed the centerpiece of Trump's political appeal. ICE operations are shutting down. Not because of budget constraints or congressional obstruction, though both have played roles, but because of a catastrophic combination of funding denial, workforce rebellion, legal challenges, and operational chaos that has rendered the agency unable to function at the scale required to fulfill the administration's promises. The juxtaposition could not be more politically devastating. While the administration is consumed by questions about who it protects and why, specifically regarding powerful men allegedly connected to Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking network, it is simultaneously failing to deliver on the immigration enforcement that was supposed to be its defining accomplishment. The very voters who overlooked controversy after controversy, who forgave indiscretion after indiscretion, who accepted chaos as the price of getting results on immigration, are now confronting the possibility that there will be no results, that the promises were empty, that the disruption was for nothing. And the president's response, characterized by those close to him as furious lashing out, blaming everyone from congressional Republicans to career bureaucrats to the media to immigrants themselves, is only making the crisis worse by confirming that the administration has lost control of both its narrative and its signature policy agenda. The ICE shutdown is not a single event, but rather the culmination of multiple failures that have been building since the beginning of Trump's second term. The administration came into office with ambitious plans to dramatically expand deportation operations, to hire tens of thousands of new agents, to construct massive new detention facilities, and to implement workplace raids and community sweeps on a scale never before attempted in American history. These plans required congressional appropriations that never materialized. Republicans and Democrats in Congress, for different reasons and with different justifications, refused to provide the funding necessary to scale operations to the promised level. Without that funding, ICE could not hire the agents, could not build the detention space, could not acquire the transportation capacity needed to execute mass deportations. But the funding denial was only the beginning of ICE's problems. The agency also faces a workforce crisis of its own making. ICE agents and officers, many of whom supported Trump and welcomed his hardline immigration stance, have become demoralized by the chaotic implementation of policies that seem to change weekly, by the lack of clear priorities about who should be targeted for deportation, and by the public backlash and legal jeopardy they face when operations go wrong. High-profile incidents of families separated, of longtime residents with deep community ties detained and deported, of workplaces raided and local economies disrupted, have generated intense criticism, and in some cases legal liability for the agents carrying out these actions. Many experienced ICE personnel have resigned or requested transfers. Recruitment of new agents has proven difficult because the agency's reputation has been so damaged, and because the work itself has become more dangerous as communities organize resistance to enforcement operations. The legal challenges have been equally crippling. Federal courts have issued injunctions blocking certain enforcement practices. State and local governments have enacted sanctuary policies that prohibit cooperation with ICE, forcing the federal agency to operate without the local intelligence and support that makes enforcement effective. Immigration advocacy organizations have flooded the courts with habeas corpus petitions, bond hearings, and appeals that overwhelm the immigration court system and slow deportations to a crawl. And the due process requirements of immigration law, which Trump has repeatedly denounced as loopholes, mean that even when someone is detained, removing them from the country is a lengthy process that requires hearings, legal representation, and judicial review. The operational realities have also proven more complex than political rhetoric suggested. Identifying, locating, detaining, processing, and removing millions of people is a logistical challenge of staggering proportions. It requires not just enforcement agents, but also detention space, immigration judges, transportation capacity, diplomatic cooperation from receiving countries, and a functioning bureaucratic infrastructure to handle the paperwork and legal proceedings. The Trump administration's approach, characterized by aggressive rhetoric but inadequate planning, has resulted in an enforcement apparatus that is simultaneously so overstretched and underperforming. Agents are conducting raids that net a handful of individuals while disrupting entire communities and generating negative publicity. Detention facilities are overcrowded with people awaiting hearings that may be months or years away. And the actual pace of deportations, the metric by which the policy should be judged, has not increased significantly, and in some categories has actually decreased compared to previous administrations. The final blow came when Congress blocked the latest funding request for ICE expansion. Democrats opposed it on principle, arguing that mass deportation is inhumane and counterproductive. But crucially, enough Republicans also voted against it, citing fiscal concerns, constituent pressure from businesses dependent on immigrant labor, and doubts about whether the administration could effectively use additional resources given the operational failures already evident. This bipartisan rejection was a stunning repudiation of the administration's immigration agenda and left ICE without the resources to continue operations at even current levels, let alone the dramatically expanded scale that had been promised. The result is what career officials are describing as a functional shutdown. ICE is not formally closed. Agents still report to work, but the agency cannot execute the mission it has been given. Enforcement actions have been dramatically scaled back. Detention facilities are releasing people because they cannot afford to hold them. Deportation flights have been curtailed. And internally, the agency is in turmoil, with leadership constantly changing, policies in flux, and workforce morale at historic lows. For all practical purposes, the mass deportation agenda that Trump campaigned on and that his base expected him to deliver has collapsed. Now layer onto this policy failure the ongoing Epstein files scandal. The administration is already defending its decision to release documents with survivor names exposed and alleged perpetrator names redacted. Attorney General Pam Bondi's refusal to acknowledge survivors during her congressional testimony generated bipartisan outrage and has become a symbol of the administration's misplaced priorities. Republicans who normally defend the administration have publicly criticized the handling of the files. Conservative influencers have turned on Bondi. Congressional investigations are intensifying. And the fundamental question that dominates coverage is who is being protected and why. The parallel is impossible to ignore. The administration is accused of protecting powerful men allegedly connected to sex trafficking, while simultaneously proving unable or unwilling to enforce immigration laws against undocumented workers, many of whom are among the most vulnerable people in the country. The optics are politically toxic. It suggests an administration that serves the interests of the elite while failing to deliver for the working-class voters who put it in power. The immigration restrictionists who supported Trump did so believing he would finally prioritize their concerns over those of business interests, wealthy employers, and political elites. The spectacle of the administration protecting Epstein associates while ICE collapses undermines that entire narrative. The president's response has been to lash out in all directions. According to multiple sources, he is furious with congressional Republicans for not funding ICE expansion, viewing their defection as betrayal. He is angry with career ICE officials, whom he blames for operational failures and for not implementing policies aggressively enough. He is attacking immigration advocates and sanctuary jurisdictions, claiming they are obstructing law enforcement. He is criticizing the media for focusing on the Epstein scandal, rather than what he characterizes as the immigration crisis. And he is even, in private conversations, expressing frustration with the undocumented immigrants themselves, as if their presence rather than his policy failures is the source of his political problems. This scattershot blame assignment is characteristic of a leader who refuses to accept responsibility for failures and who cannot acknowledge that some problems are the result of his own decisions. The Epstein Files disaster happened because the administration chose to prioritize protecting certain names over transparency and justice. The ICE collapse happened because the administration promised more than was logistically, politically, or financially feasible, and then failed to adapt when reality asserted itself. Lashing out at everyone else does not solve either problem. It simply broadcasts weakness and desperation. The political consequences are severe and multiplying. The Republican base that elected Trump specifically because of his immigration stance is frustrated and disillusioned. They were promised mass deportations. They were promised an end to sanctuary cities. They were promised that immigration laws would finally be enforced. What they are getting instead is operational failure, legal defeats, and political theater. Some are beginning to question whether Trump can actually deliver, or whether he is just another politician who talks tough but fails to follow through. This erosion of base confidence is dangerous for any politician, but particularly for Trump, whose entire brand is built on the perception that he, unlike other politicians, keeps his promises and gets results. Congressional Republicans are in an increasingly difficult position. Many privately acknowledge that the mass deportation agenda was always unrealistic, that the numbers Trump cited were politically appealing but operationally impossible. But they cannot say this publicly without angering the base and appearing to undermine their own president. So they are caught between defending policies they know are failing and distancing themselves from those policies at the risk of primary challenges. The vote against ICE funding revealed the depth of this discomfort. Enough Republicans were willing to break ranks to ensure the funding failed, but most tried to do so quietly, hoping to avoid the political backlash from Trump loyalists. Democrats, meanwhile, are seizing the opportunity to argue that Trump's immigration agenda has always been more about rhetoric than results, more about stirring fear and resentment than actually addressing immigration policy challenges. They point to the ICE collapse as evidence that Trump is incompetent, that his promises were lies, and that his entire approach to immigration is rooted in xenophobia rather than practical governance. They are also linking the ICE failure to the Epstein scandal, arguing that both reveal an administration that prioritizes protecting the powerful over serving the vulnerable, that values loyalty over competence, and that has lost the moral and operational capacity to govern effectively. The broader immigration debate has become even more polarized and toxic as a result of this crisis. Immigration restrictionists argue that the ICE collapse proves that the political establishment, including some Republicans, is unwilling to enforce immigration laws, and that Trump's failure is the result of sabotage rather than his own policy choices. Immigration advocates counter that the collapse demonstrates the inhumanity and impracticality of mass deportation, that families and communities have been needlessly traumatized by an enforcement regime that was destined to fail, and that the country needs comprehensive reform rather than aggressive enforcement of a broken system. The economic implications are also significant. Industries that depend on immigrant labor, both documented and undocumented, have been in limbo, unsure whether enforcement will intensify or collapse. The uncertainty itself has economic costs as businesses delay hiring, as workers avoid interactions with authorities even when legal, and as communities live in constant fear. The ICE collapse may actually provide some relief to these sectors, but it also means that the underlying policy questions about immigration, labor, and economic need remain unresolved. The disruption has been enormous, the political cost has been paid, and yet nothing has actually been solved. Internationally, the ICE collapse and the Epstein scandal are both being used by adversaries to undermine American credibility. China and Russia highlight the dysfunction as evidence that democratic governance is chaotic and ineffective. They point to the Epstein files' mishandling as proof of American moral hypocrisy. They cite the immigration enforcement failures as indication that America cannot control its own territory or implement its own laws. These are propaganda narratives, but they resonate in parts of the world where American leadership and American values are already questioned. The damage to soft power is real and will take years to repair. For the millions of undocumented immigrants living in the United States, the ICE collapse brings a complex mix of relief and continued uncertainty. The immediate threat of raids and deportations has receded as the agency's operational capacity has cratered, but the underlying vulnerability remains. Legal status has not changed. The political forces that demanded enforcement have not disappeared, and the next administration, or even a reorganized effort within this administration, could revive aggressive enforcement. The trauma of living in fear, of seeing families separated, of watching communities targeted, does not disappear just because enforcement operations have temporarily scaled back. The career federal workforce at ICE and related agencies is demoralized and divided. Some agents remain committed to aggressive enforcement and are frustrated by what they see as a lack of resources and political support. Others have become disillusioned with policies they view as cruel and ineffective. Still others are simply trying to do their jobs professionally in an environment that has become politically toxic and operationally chaotic. The long-term damage to these agencies, in terms of institutional knowledge, workforce stability, and public trust, will be significant. The convergence of the Epstein scandal and the ICE collapse represents a broader crisis of governance and credibility. An administration that cannot manage a scandal about protecting the powerful while simultaneously failing to deliver on its signature policy agenda has lost the two things essential to political survival: moral authority and practical competence. The Epstein files disaster undermines any claim to moral leadership. The ICE collapse undermines any claim to effective governance. Together, they paint a portrait of an administration that is both ethically compromised and operationally incompetent. The path forward is unclear and fraught with political peril. On the Epstein front, the administration could attempt to regain credibility through genuine transparency, full unredacted releases that protect survivors but expose alleged perpetrators, and accountability for those who made the redaction decisions. But this would likely reveal uncomfortable connections and raise questions the administration would prefer to avoid. On immigration, the administration could acknowledge reality, scale back the mass deportation rhetoric, and focus on more targeted and achievable enforcement priorities. But this would require admitting that the promises were unrealistic, that the disruption was for nothing, and that a different approach is needed. Neither path is politically palatable, so the administration is likely to continue trying to blame others for failures of its own making. For Trump personally, this is a moment of crisis that reveals the limitations of his political approach. Aggressive rhetoric, promises of dramatic action, attacks on critics, and refusal to accept responsibility have carried him through many controversies. But when signature policies actually collapse, when operational failures are undeniable, when the gap between promise and reality becomes too wide to spin away, that approach fails. Voters who tolerated chaos because they believed Trump was delivering results are now confronting the possibility that there are no results to justify the chaos. The next weeks and months will reveal whether the administration can recover from this twin crisis or whether it marks the beginning of a broader political collapse. The Epstein investigations will either uncover information that forces resignations and policy changes, or they will drag on, creating sustained negative coverage and eroding public confidence. The ICE situation will either be stabilized through some combination of funding, operational reforms, and scaled-back ambitions, or it will remain a symbol of failed governance and broken promises. Other crises will inevitably emerge, as they always do, and the administration's capacity to handle them will depend on whether it has any remaining credibility and competence. What is already clear is that an administration that entered office promising to transform immigration enforcement and to drain the swamp of corruption is instead presiding over the collapse of its signature policy and is mired in a scandal about protecting powerful elites. The irony would be almost amusing if the consequences were not so serious. Real people's lives are affected by immigration policy failures. Real survivors are traumatized by the mishandling of the Epstein files. Real questions about justice, accountability, and governance are at stake. The president's decision to lash out, to blame everyone but himself, to attack rather than adapt, suggests a leader who has lost the capacity for self-reflection or strategic adjustment. It is a response that might satisfy the immediate emotional need to project strength and deflect criticism, but it solves nothing. It does not restore ICE's operational capacity. It does not address the legitimate concerns about the Epstein files. It does not rebuild the political coalition that is fracturing under the weight of broken promises and moral compromises. It simply broadcasts to everyone watching that the administration is in crisis, that leadership is failing, and that the problems will likely get worse before they get better. In the end, this moment will be remembered as a case study in how not to govern, how not to respond to crisis, and how not to manage the gap between political rhetoric and policy reality. The twin collapse of the immigration enforcement agenda and the moral authority necessary to lead is not an accident or bad luck. It is the predictable result of over-promising and under-delivering, of prioritizing loyalty over competence, of choosing confrontation over compromise, and of refusing to accept that governing a complex democracy requires more than aggressive tweets and angry speeches. The Trump administration is learning, perhaps too late, that there are some problems that cannot be solved by lashing out, some failures that cannot be blamed away, and some crises that reveal fundamental unfitness for the responsibilities that leadership demands.